This is NC Spin, an unrehearsed discussion on issues of interest to North Carolinians. Now, here is your moderator, Tom Campbell.
Welcome. You've heard and read the spin the media and the politicians have put on the issues of the day. To get the correct spin on what's going on in North Carolina, let's introduce you to our panel of experts. They include former Supreme Court Justice and former Republican, if we remember correctly, Bob Orr.
They're going to believe that.
Yeah. Chris Fitzsimon from NC Policy Watch, Syndicated columnist and author John Hood, and political consultant J. Brad Crone. Well, we've got a good show for you, loaded with topics beginning with the ruling that blocks the federal government from allowing transgenders to use bathrooms of their choice. We'll also talk about two key rulings declaring legislative districts unconstitutional and voter ID. Plus, we will kick off the traditional election season with our panel opinion on how things are going. And as always, we ask the panel to tell us something we don't know. Let's get started. The fallout from North Carolina's House Bill 2 continues. In response to the bill that requires people to use bathrooms that correspond with the sex on their birth certificates, the government issued a mandate that public schools must allow transgender students to use bathrooms in locker rooms consistent with their chosen identity. But two recent federal court rulings, one in Virginia and one in Texas, has blocked that order. Reed O'Connor, the judge in Texas ruling, said, this case presents a difficult issue of balancing the protection of students' rights and that of personal privacy while ensuring that no student is unnecessarily marginalized while attending school. Chris Fitzsimon, the judge went on to say that he wanted to see if the Supreme Court was going to take up this subject, and he also objected because he said the government didn't allow time for comments on the directive. Now, some believe this is a victory for North Carolina, and other states that are suing the federal government over transgender rights. What do you say?
I say it's too early to tell. A district court judge in Texas doesn't have jurisdiction over the entire federal court system. We have a case pending in the Middle District Court of North Carolina before a conservative Judge Schroeder, who actually has heard pleadings for an injunction on the enforcement of HB 2. There's going to be a trial in November. But I do think this case is the Supreme Court's going to have to decide whether they want to hear it or not. I mean, they're going to be the final arbiter on this case. But what's fascinating to me is while all this is going on, these court cases have given us a window into what the politicians think. Governor Pat McCrory has said repeatedly this isn't about transgender people and predators, and yet he's filed a brief in that very case in federal court that sort of questions transgenderism at all, whether it's actually a real thing, and quotes one alleged medical group that tries to have gay therapy to convert kids back to being straight. Lieutenant Governor Dan Farr said this past week, transgender thing isn't real at all. Somebody can just decide one day they're transgender and one day they're not. So this issue is very much in the public and in the courts.
Just Zora, does this verdict just affect public education, or does it apply to all public facilities or even private businesses?
Well, the Texas ruling dealt with the Title IX question that the federal government's authority in regard to schools. But, you know, I've got to say this, Tom. A year ago, would we have thought that we'd be sitting here talking about all of these federal courts and maybe a U.S. Supreme Court consideration of transgender bathroom issues? And I have to say, I find it terribly frustrating that this is one of those issues that people with different views should have sat down and respected the privacy of individuals and the concerns and done and made an effort to educate
Lord
people.
knows there have been some good people trying.
For the sake of clarification, though, I think it's really important the United States Supreme Court take up this issue, because if there really does need to be some type of legal guidance on what is reasonable accommodation, from protection of the individual, you know, putting a 14-year-old biological girl in a locker room with a bunch of 14-year-old boys in a shower situation, you know, does not pass the common sense test for a lot of people. So having some legal clarification and guidance from the Supreme Court on that, I think would be a good thing.
Well, with a 4-4 split on the Supreme Court, John, can we expect much to come out of them even if they undertake it?
They will undertake it. They might undertake it with a ninth justice. Remember, we do have an election and then a subsequent action. Look, it's important to remember that Texas case was really about two different matters. One of them is what y'all are getting at. Does the federal law as currently written, Title IX and Title VII and others, when it says sex, does it mean biological sex or does it mean a broader category? That's one set of issues. The court had a little bit to say about that. The main part of the decision, where the bulk of the decision and the real significance of it, was finding that this was a regulation. You see, the Obama administration put out a regulation that said you have to do this or we'll take your money away. And then when they realized they had not actually gone through the legal process of issuing a regulation, they said, oh, never mind, it's just advice. But you better do it or we'll take your money away. And that's what got them into trouble. That is primarily why they lost in the court. And I think they will lose on appeal.
So very quickly, let me go around the table. How's this going to affect the lawsuits on HB2? Brad?
Well, I think North Carolina, I think you'll see action out of the federal court. HB2 is a bad law and they need to rescind it.
Chris?
Oh, I think there'll be a contentious trial in November. I actually think people might be surprised at the ruling the judge makes on the injunction about whether or not to enforce it.
You know, I just can't get over the fact that we're asking the Supreme Court to make a common sense decision on an issue that
we ought to be able to resolve ourselves.
we ought to be able to resolve ourselves.
John?
I will say that I am not sure whether North Carolina or the plaintiffs against North Carolina will ultimately prevail. I am confident that the Obama administration, the Justice Department's position, will fail. I think it does not pass the common sense test for even most of the Democratic appointees on the Supreme Court. It is a preposterous position.
Well, we thank you for watching NC Spin on the air or on YouTube. Here's a reminder, there's much more on our website, ncspin.com or NC Spin on Facebook. You'll find video footage not seen anywhere else, perspective pieces from our panel, and my weekly column. Get more balanced debate from the Old North State on ncspin.com, NC Spin on Facebook, or on Twitter at NC Spin Tweets. When we come back, the legislature loses in court again.
NC Spin will return after these messages.
Baseball players from other countries are considered guest workers here. Baseball, the previous administration and Congress cut a deal in 2006 allowing foreign players to travel freely across the country. Not so for agriculture guest workers. They're vilified for doing work Americans won't, and they face a mountain of red tape just to get here. Shouldn't American agriculture get the same consideration as baseball? Farm Bureau and Agriculture, we keep North Carolina growing.
I help educate and inspire visually impaired students to strive for a brighter future.
I make sure visitors to the North Carolina Zoo take a walk on the wild side.
And I make sure that the fuel you buy is a quality product from pipeline to pump.
I support small businesses in North Carolina by matching them with hard-working, well-trained employees.
I make sure the roads you drive on are safe.
Scenic, the one voice speaking in support of the men and women who are making North Carolina great.
We now return to NC Spin.
Legislative actions continue to stimulate court cases, and in many instances, the legislature is losing them. The U.S. Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals recently threw out key provisions of the 2013 voter law, with the three-judge panel saying there's little doubt it was intended to suppress voting by African Americans. Another three-judge panel declared that more than 24 of North Carolina's legislative districts were unconstitutional on grounds of racial gerrymandering, citing evidence they had sought data, the legislators had sought data about minority voters before determining the districts. Judge, we thought the responses by House Speaker Tim Moore and Senate President Pro Tem Phil Berger were interesting. They essentially said these federal judges were appointed by Democrats and were trying to steal the elections for Democrats in North Carolina. Do you agree with that reaction?
No. For two individuals that have law licenses, I find the response a little surprising, to say the least. But you've got to understand two things, Tom. One, the Fourth Circuit is, in fact, a much more liberal circuit court now than historically it's been. And secondly, anytime you get race in elections, whether it's redistricting, whether it's election law limitations or provisions, you have a volatile combination. And in both of those cases, you saw the court say the intent of the legislature was based on race. And the problem for Republicans, when they try to cook the books from an election standpoint, like the Democrats historically did, they bump up against the fact that most African Americans are registered Democrats. So
and vote overwhelmingly Democrat.
Yes, and so whatever they do.
But Chris, we
affects
like to think that justice is blind. Just exactly how much does politics play in the decisions on these appellate courts?
Well, I don't know. We'll never know.
I ought to be asking Bob.
You ought to be
Moore.
asking him. I mean, here's what I know about the voting rights case. Now, what the Fourth Circuit decided, whether you can agree with it or not, they chose to change the voting methods that are used disproportionately by African Americans. Michael Bitzer of Catawba College recently had a statistic: 78% of African Americans use early voting, 40% of white voters use early voting. They shortened early voting. African Americans are more likely to register same day in the early voting. They eliminated same day registration, and on and on and on. So it's hard not to conclude that the things that they changed, used primarily more by African Americans, the point of it was to try to suppress the vote of African Americans. That's what the decision is all about, and that's why so many people, I think, were alarmed by the law.
John, let's look at these verdicts individually. The court ruled that in November's election laws that voter ID will not be required. Governor McCrory and Republican leaders asked for a stay on that decision until after November 8th, but it was quickly denied. Does that give you any indication, perhaps, about subsequent legal action?
Not necessarily. The Fourth Circuit decision on this is basically without precedent. In no other case that the attorneys, and I'm not an attorney, so when we talk about legal issues, I call attorneys. And in no other case that anybody can cite has a court of appeals ever thrown out the findings of fact wholesale, hundreds of pages of specific, answering all the questions that the Fourth Circuit threw out there without any evidence. And they basically cite two pieces of evidence for their proof. Number one of the lawmakers asked for racial breakdowns of the various voting methods, a request that was required by the Voting Rights Act. And the second thing was a quote from Don Yelton, who was a self-appointed Republican precinct candidate. He showed up at a county convention, he and his wife. There were 3 people that voted. So he and his wife voted for him to be a precinct official. He was then cited by the U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals as an authoritative or at least illustrative source about what people in Raleigh were thinking when this was a ridiculous decision. Even though some of the merits of the issues I think are debatable, same-day voter registration, I don't agree with all of what the legislature did, but the Court of Appeals decision is embarrassing, no matter what you think of the outcome.
Some of the objections to this, Brad, focus on the fact of voter ID fraud. In fact, the Republican Party recently issued a press release, or some Republican operative released a press release talking about more than 1,000 voters still on the rolls that are over 100 years old. How big a problem is voter fraud, really?
I think it's a real minuscule problem here in the state of North Carolina. I think North Carolina has historically done a very good job on maintaining their statewide voter base database, and I think it's minuscule. I mean, I think that it's only a limited number of cases across the state out of 4 million votes cast.
Bob, I want to move over to the topic on the legislative districts. The court said there wasn't time to redraw the districts before November's elections, and certainly after their verdict, we can agree with that. But the lawsuits on this were filed very shortly after the 2013 redistricting took place. Why did it take the court so long to rule on this?
Well, it takes a while, just the process of setting up for trial, going through a trial, as I recall.
But it didn't take them that long to rule on congressional redistricting.
But the bottom line is, and I think this goes to your question, Tom, is that there is a certain uncertainty about having elections in districts that have been ruled unconstitutional. You know, I mean, what's the impact of that?
I think one thing, I was listening to John's comments a few minutes ago, and running through my mind, you know, the General Assembly did get pre-clearance out of the Civil Rights Division, out of the Department of Justice.
Bob Rucho and David Lewis said that.
I think that's a point that's probably missed in this.
But pre-clearance doesn't mean constitutional.
Right.
I mean, there have been districts that have been pre-cleared before that have been struck down.
They have.
The districts that Democrats drew.
That is historical in nature, too, because, you know, back in 2000, we went through 3 different rounds of redistricting.
Here's our problem with this decision. It's like a lot of the other ones. And look, gerrymandering is bad. I wish we could get rid of it. Unfortunately, this decision is not going to help us get rid of gerrymandering because it further fuzzes up what the Voting Rights Act requires. What we need is a clear decision from the U.S. Supreme Court that says this is what it means, so everybody can stop litigating, and then maybe we can reform the process.
But we've had some clear decisions.
Well, we haven't had
the federal court said redistricting for Greensboro's elections was unconstitutional.
Well,
Wake County's elections are unconstitutional. Right. Congressional districts are unconstitutional, and now they say the legislative districts are unconstitutional. Either we've got judges that are legislating from the bench, or we've got unconstitutional gerrymandering going on, which is...
Well, I think we definitely have unconstitutional gerrymandering. I do think John has a point about we don't know what the threshold of appropriate the race makeup of the districts would be, but it's also worth pointing out in the legislative district, this was a Republican Justice, Judge Schroeder, was one of a 3-judge panel. It was unanimous. This wasn't all Democratic judges that threw this out, as the Republicans like to allege. A Republican judge also thought these districts were unconstitutional.
All right, go ahead, Bob. Finish it up.
Well, John's right. Race is a mess from the standpoint of federal jurisprudence, but it was interesting in the voter ID case that the court said, well, if there was any other intent other than race, it might be okay. So where does that leave us?
All right. Well, it leaves us getting ready to kick off election season after these messages. Stay with us.
NC Spin will return after these messages.
You only get one pair of eyes. Keeping them healthy is critical to your quality of life. Members of the NC Optometric Society know this. These highly skilled doctors have the latest technology and the medical training to care for your eyes and the eyes of those you love. Make sure you visit your optometrist for an eye exam on a regular basis. For more information on keeping your eyes healthy or to find the right optometrist for you, visit nceyes.org. Remember, healthy eyes, healthier lives. Healthy individuals improve the economic health of communities. Growing Better Together explores this intersection of rural health and economic development. Join the conversation and meet candidates for governor and U.S. Senate September 26-27 at the 2016 North Carolina Rural Assembly. Register now at ncruralcenter.org.
You sleep on concrete till your body get immune to concrete.
My mom got my brother and I up and said, come on, we're leaving.
I became homeless in the beginning of this year.
When I was about 4 or 5 years old, our house caught fire.
I used to see my brother. If he see me, he'd turn and go the other direction.
We did the only thing that we could think of, and we went to a Salvation Army shelter.
We don't have this, what's your background look like? We just say, what do you need?
I remember the man from the Salvation Army coming down with a box of clothes.
The Salvation Army officer bought my brother and I an ice cream cone.
Last week, my brother walked up to me, and he just started a conversation.
Today I've given my life to the Salvation Army because I remember what somebody did for me, my brother, and my mom over 30 years ago.
The Salvation Army for me means hope.
Compassion.
Family.
Support.
We now return to NC Spin.
September 1 is the traditional kickoff for elections in our state. Nobody's going to disagree. This has been a most unusual campaign cycle. Democrats are salivating because they believe this is going to be a good year for their candidates, but Republicans caution them not to count their chickens before they're hatched. Brad, some polls continue to show this state in play, not only for the presidency, but also down ballot races. As we count down the days before the elections, how are you reading it? You told BuzzFeed this past week that you see a political tsunami forming.
Absolutely, and I think it's continuing to build. And the problem, the Republicans have got problems in the metropolitan regions of each, Charlotte, Greensboro, and the Raleigh, which is almost 80% of the total votes cast in a general election, especially with the horseshoe counties. And they've got real big problems with unaffiliated voters. We're seeing historic crossover rates too, Tom. So, the bad news for the Democrats is that if they had gone out and recruited more candidates,
better candidates,
they would be even more successful.
John, Carter Wren, who's one of the most seasoned Republican political operatives in the state, said this could be one of the worst election years Republicans have seen in many years, decades, and it could reverse the political direction of our state. Is he overreacting, or is this situation that bad?
Republicans are definitely in trouble, but I think that is an overstatement. If you look carefully at the numbers, Governor McCrory has the biggest challenge right now. the legislative races, as Brad said, the Democrats have left a few seats on the table they could have competed for. And what will happen in 2016 is, for a variety of reasons, somewhat of a Democratic tilt. 2018 is probably going to go back the other way. So I think getting too carried away with this, it reminds me of Republicans in 2012. Now that we've won the legislature with supermajorities and the governor and everything's going to move our way, and this is a sort of enduring Republican majority kind of thing, that is almost always unwise in a competitive state to say things have moved in decisively in one direction. It'll move back and forth.
Chris, the polls are showing that the presidential race is still pretty close. I mean, most of the polls that we're seeing, and there are more and more of them coming out now, show this to be within the margin of error as far as Clinton and Trump are concerned. So tell me, why are the Republicans getting panicked, and should they be concerned about down ballot races?
Well, I think obviously they should be. Governor McCrory is down by, depending on the last polls that came out this week, 6 to 9%. Richard Burr is in a statistical dead heat. I think he's 2 points ahead in the last poll. He was 1 point behind in the poll, which is a big surprise considering he's been in the Senate for 2 terms and been in Congress for a long time. He's running against a newcomer, former state legislator, Deborah Ross. I think the Trump-Clinton numbers will actually fall in line with those as we get closer to the general election, unless something happens and Donald Trump transforms himself into a normal human being, into being behind, significantly behind. I mean, I think that Trump will likely lose North Carolina. The question is by how many points. I think it is going to be a Democratic year. The question is, can the Republicans do anything to mitigate that and sort of limit their losses? I don't think so.
Bob, Brad talked a little bit about voter registrations, and recent indications are Democratic registrations continue to decline, Republicans are static, the big gains are coming from unaffiliated voters. What do you think this portends for November's elections?
Well, I think one of the questions is all these new people moving into the state, many of whom are registering unaffiliated, so they don't really have a voting history in North Carolina. So some of the models that I think we predict how candidates are going to fare won't work. And so I think it's either a really bad year for the Republicans or the key races, governor, Senate, they hold on and barely squeak through with some losses.
But on that voter registration issue, a lot of the voters, particularly in Mecklenburg and in Wake County, which, as you said, control about 20 to 30% of the total vote in North Carolina, are younger voters, and many of them are registering Democrats.
They are, and you're also seeing a lot of gain with the unaffiliated vote. John Davis put out a report this week talking about the importance of the unaffiliated vote and noted, Tom, that the unaffiliated vote will be 26 to 27% of your total votes cast.
Wow. After these messages, we're going to ask the panel to tell us something we don't know.
NC Spin is brought to you in part by the North Carolina Farm Bureau. The Farm Bureau and Agriculture. We keep North Carolina growing.
The cost of everything has gone up dramatically over the last 75 years. With one exception, keeping electricity affordable. That's the power of your co-op membership. Learn more at togetherwesave.com.
North Carolina's Touchstone Energy Cooperatives, looking out for you.
It's a fact, patients who receive care in the medical home from a trusted family physician reduce healthcare costs through prevention, early detection, and affordable management of high-cost chronic diseases.
Every dollar invested in healthcare matters. Let's invest them wisely, building on North Carolina's medical home model. Better health begins with a medical home, a trusted family physician, the best return on our healthcare investment. Learn about the importance of medical homes at ournchealthcare.com.
I help educate and inspire visually impaired students to strive for a brighter future.
I make sure visitors to the North Carolina Zoo take a walk on the wild side.
And I make sure that the fuel you buy is a quality product from pipeline to pump.
I support small businesses in North Carolina by matching them with hard-working, well-trained employees.
I make sure the roads you drive on are safe.
Scenic, the one voice speaking in support of the men and women who are making North Carolina great.
We now return to NC Spin.
Now it's time for the part of the show that so many of you tell us is your favorite. And that's when we ask the panel to tell us something we don't know. They choose the topic, sound off on it for a few seconds, and we'll start with you, John.
Thank you. Following up on our previous conversation, I'm an advocate of using poll averages to track how races are going, not just grabbing one or two polls. If you average all the recent polls, 6 or 7 polls in the key races, it's 2-3-4. Clinton leads Trump by 2, Cooper leads McCrory by 3, and Richard Burr leads Deborah Ross by 4. But those are all very close, and that tells you how competitive we are this year.
And we've been talking all along about the fact that this is too early to be using poll data and taking too much from it.
It's not too early to be using it for insight. It is too early to make firm predictions about November and August.
Okay. Tell us something we don't know, Brad Crone.
Tom, I've been in this business 25 years doing political consulting work. I'm seeing the highest crossover rates of Republicans ever. In 1996, it averaged at 6%. The statewide average of Republicans, self-identified Republicans, saying they're going to support Democrats at the federal and the state level, usually averages around 3%. We're seeing percentages in the state at 15% right now.
Interesting. Is that because of who's leading the ticket?
It's it's Donald Trump, and it's your horseshoe counties around Charlotte, Greensboro, Winston, and Raleigh.
Interesting. Bob Orr, tell us something we don't know.
128 years ago, on August 18th, 1888, the monument to Dr. Elisha Mitchell was dedicated on the crest of the highest mountain east of the Mississippi River, Mount Mitchell. And we'll be celebrating the 100th anniversary of the Mount Mitchell State Park this weekend, along with the 100th anniversary of our state park system.
Interesting. Chris, tell us something we don't know.
Some of the brightest kids in the state of Indiana are now applying for a 4-year college scholarship if paid for by the state of Indiana if they agree to stay in the classroom and teach for 5 years. If that sounds familiar, it was patterned after the North Carolina Teaching Fellows program. In fact, they actually asked the Public School Forum to help them write the bill that passed the Indiana legislature last year, passed by almost unanimously in the House and the Senate, was signed into law by Governor Mike Pence, who is, of course, now the vice presidential candidate for Republicans. The question is, why in the world, if the state of Indiana and a conservative Republican legislature with supermajorities and a conservative Republican governor think that's a good idea, did our General Assembly abolish the program and deny North Carolina kids that same opportunity?
What's your response to that? Why did they?
I think it was politics, and they were revenge because it was started by Democrats. And it's a shame because the Republicans in Indiana aren't smart enough to see a good idea and use it.
Okay. Well, we hope you've enjoyed this week's edition of NC Spin. We'll be back next week with more issues of interest to you in North Carolina. Until that time, as we always say, stay informed and watch out for the spin.
Join us next week and get the spin on issues facing our state.